Texas, 1944. The sky opened like a furnace that morning, wide and burning over the endless plains. A convoy of army trucks crawled through the dust near Abilene, engines rattling, the smell of diesel and heat mixing with the dry scent of mesquite. Inside one of them sat a handful of German prisoners, young women, their uniforms stiff with salt and sweat, eyes empty from months of travel. For them, this land was supposed to be hell. They had been told that America was merciless, a machine that ground its enemies into dust. That was the rumor that spread through the Luftwaffe barracks before capture. Prisoners beaten, starved, buried beneath desert suns. But when the truck doors finally opened, the first thing they saw wasn't barbed wire or rifles. It was open land, gold and green, beneath a sky so large it felt like another world. A man in a worn hat stood waiting beside a corral. He looked nothing like a guard. His sleeves were rolled, hands rough from work, a lasso hanging loosely at his side. "Ma'am," he said gently, "watch your step." The prisoners hesitated. They had braced for shouting, for hatred. Instead, they found calm. The man passed them tin cups of water from a galvanized bucket. Cold, clean. The taste hit like a miracle. Among the women was 25-year-old Helene Kruger, a radio operator from Bremen. She had seen war swallow cities whole. Now she stood under that impossible sky and realized the stories had been wrong. Around her, cattle shifted lazily beyond the fence. A windmill creaked in the distance. A dog barked once and lay back down in the shade. "This is your camp," the man said, pointing toward a line of white barracks and a small flag snapping in the breeze. "You'll be working with us." Feeding stock, cleaning stalls, riding if you're willing. Helene almost laughed. Riding? She'd expected chains, not saddles. Yet as the days unfolded, the contradiction deepened. There were guards, yes, but they spoke with courtesy. There was order, but not cruelty. Meals came on time. Stew, bread, coffee. Every small kindness struck her like a strange kind of mercy. At night, when the Texas air cooled and crickets filled the dark, Helene lay awake on her bunk, listening to the quiet hum of the prairie. She had never known a silence that big. It frightened her at first, then soothed her. Back home, they had said America was a land of greed, of men who cared only for money and machines. But here, among the ranchers and dust, everything moved by a different rhythm. Work, eat, rest. Work again. There was pride in labor, not fear of punishment. When she wrote her first letter home, the censors blacked out half the page, but one line slipped through. "They treat us as people, not as prisoners. I do not understand it." The truth was, few of them did. America had captured over 400,000 Axis soldiers by then, yet, across its camps, order came not from terror, but from discipline and decency. A prisoner fed and busy, the commanders believed, was a safer prisoner. But to Helene, it felt like something deeper, a quiet lesson in the strength that doesn't need to shout. One evening, the man in the tan hat, the ranch owner, Frank Calloway, came by the stables where she worked. He leaned against the fence, watching her struggle with a saddle strap. "Don't pull against it," he said, stepping closer. "Let the leather give. You fight it, it'll fight you back." Helene blinked, unsure if it was advice about the strap or about life itself. That night, she wrote in her journal, "He smiled at me as if war did not exist. How can such men live in a world like this?" In the quiet spaces between fear and kindness, something new was forming. Not peace, not yet, but the first fragile outline of it. And in a world that had forgotten mercy, that was enough to change everything. The sun rose slow and gold the next morning, burning through the thin mist that hugged the pasture. Dew clung to the fences, and the smell of hay filled the air. The women had begun to settle into routine, feed the cattle, scrub the troughs, mend what was broken. Work that had no politics, no ranks, just rhythm. For the first time since her capture, Helene began to feel her hands belonged to her again. The war had stolen so much, the right to choose, the right to rest. But here, the simple act of labor was a kind of redemption. The Americans seemed to believe that even their enemies deserved dignity, so long as they did their share. Frank Calloway ran the ranch with the same calm patience he gave his horses. He rarely raised his voice. When one of the prisoners broke a crate of feed by accident, she expected fury. Instead, he said, "Wood's cheap." "People ain't." That sentence stuck in Helene's head for days. Each evening, the ranch hands gathered by the fire after supper. They played harmonica and guitar, passing around tin mugs of coffee and swapping stories about storms and cattle drives. The German women sat at a distance at first, stiff and watchful. But music has a way of breaking walls. One night, one of the cowboys began to hum a tune Helene recognized, Lily Marlene. It was the song that had followed them through every camp and broadcast back home. When she softly sang the German words under her breath, the cowboy caught her eye, smiled, and kept playing. Others joined in, English and German weaving together, one melody under a sky of stars. In that moment, the air felt weightless. Enemies singing the same song. Helene would never forget it. The next morning, she rose before dawn and went to the stables alone. Frank found her brushing down one of the horses, its dark coat gleaming under the lantern light. "You like her?" he asked. Helene nodded. "She listens." "Good," he said. "Most folks don't." It wasn't until that day that she began to understand what freedom meant in America. It wasn't about walls or fences. It was about trust. The other women felt it too. They started to laugh more, argue less, even tease the ranch hands. When a dust storm rolled across the plains one afternoon, the women ran beside the cowboys, helping drive the cattle toward shelter. Rain lashed, wind screamed, and for hours they fought against the chaos together. When it finally passed, everyone was soaked, caked in mud, and exhausted. But no one spoke of sides anymore. Frank grinned through the dirt. "You gals just saved half my herd," he said. "Didn't think the Reich trained you for that." Helene, wiping mud from her face, replied softly, "We were trained for many things, not kindness." That night, laughter filled the bunkhouse, louder than the thunder outside. Someone had painted a sign on an old wooden plank and hung it above the door. "The Cowgirl Prisoners of Calloway Ranch." The name stuck. Weeks became months. The letters home continued, each one a miracle of disbelief. Their families wrote back, begging for truth. "You ride horses? You eat meat every day?" one mother wrote. "Are you sure you are not dreaming?" Helene didn't know how to answer. Sometimes it did feel like a dream, one that trembled on the edge of vanishing every time a truck rumbled past, carrying soldiers toward the front. But the dream held, and as it did, it began to change something inside her that even she hadn't noticed breaking. The belief that mercy was weakness. Frank had said once, while fixing a fence, "If you gotta prove you're strong, you ain't." Helene didn't understand it then, but as winter crept closer, she began to. One morning, the news came across the ranch radio. Germany was retreating. Whole cities were falling. The men went quiet, listening to the static between reports. Helene felt the sound in her bones, like something ending far away but echoing through her chest. That evening, she walked alone to the edge of the pasture. The sun was sinking low, painting everything in gold and blood. She thought of home, of Bremen's broken streets, of her father's voice lost to the war, of the lies they had believed. Frank found her there, hands buried in her pockets, shoulders trembling. "You'll be going home soon," he said quietly. She nodded but didn't speak. "Scared?" "Yes," she whispered. "But not of you." He smiled a little. "That's something." Then he took off his hat, brushed the dust from its brim, and handed it to her. "Keep it." "So you remember, not all prisons got bars?" Helene laughed through tears. "And not all guards have guns," she said. The wind picked up then, rolling across the fields, carrying the faint scent of rain and smoke. Somewhere, a radio crackled again. News from Europe, final and irreversible. The war was ending. But for Helene Kruger, the real battle had already been fought, and quietly won. Here, among strangers who chose decency over hate. The day peace was announced, the Texas plains were quiet. No parades, no cheering, just wind through the grass, and a long silence that seemed to stretch to the edge of the earth. The radio in Frank's kitchen repeated the words again and again. Germany has surrendered. The war in Europe is over. For the women at Callaway Ranch, it didn't feel real. They had lived inside a different world for so long, a place of labor and laughter, of trust, built one small act at a time. Now that world was ending. Army trucks rolled up to the ranch a week later. Officers stepped out with clipboards, their voices clipped and efficient. Repatriation orders. Each prisoner was to be processed, catalogued, and returned to her homeland. Helene folded her few belongings into a small canvas bag, a handkerchief, a worn notebook, and the Stetson hat Frank had given her. She didn't speak much that morning. None of them did. Frank stood near the corral, watching as they prepared to leave. He looked older somehow, though it had only been months. When Helene approached, he tried to smile. "You ready to go home?" She looked at the horizon instead of his eyes. "I don't know what home is anymore." He nodded slowly. "Maybe you'll find it again. Maybe you'll make a new one." Before she could answer, the driver called her name. She hesitated, then reached out and took Frank's hand. "You showed me something I didn't think existed," she said. He tipped his hat. "Just did what was right, ma'am." As the truck rumbled away, Helene looked back through the slats at the ranch shrinking into the distance. The windmill spun lazily. The men waved their hats. For a moment, the dust glowed like gold around them. She pressed her fingers to her lips, then to the brim of her hat. Goodbye, Texas. The journey home took months, across trains, ports, and ships. When they finally stepped off the transport in Bremerhaven, winter had come again. The docks were twisted ruins. The city was little more than ash. No brass bands, no welcome. Just the smell of coal smoke and loss. Helene walked the shattered streets in silence. Where her house once stood, there was a crater. Her parents were gone. Her friends scattered or dead. Germany had become a ghost of itself. And yet, as she wandered through the rubble, something inside her stayed steady. She remembered the wide skies of Texas, the laughter by the fire, the way the Cowboys had said thank you after every meal. She had seen a country that didn't need to hate to be strong. That memory became her compass. In the months that followed, Helene used her rough English to find work as a translator for the Allied forces. The soldiers were surprised at her accent. Half German, half Texan. When she called officers partner or said ain't, they laughed. She laughed too. Sometimes, at night, she would take out the old hat and run her hand along its brim. It still smelled faintly of leather and dust. It reminded her that mercy wasn't a weakness. It was a kind of courage. 3 years later, in 1948, she was invited to speak at a Reconstruction conference in Munich. The topic: Building Peace Through Understanding. Standing on the stage, she looked out at a sea of faces, Allied and German women seated side by side. Her hands trembled, but her voice was clear. "I was a prisoner," she said, "but I was never treated as one. On a ranch in Texas, I learned that dignity doesn't come from victory or from pride. It comes from kindness. And kindness," she paused, "survives everything." When she finished, the hall was silent. Then someone began to clap. Then another. Soon, the whole room was standing. Among them, a young American woman came forward, tears in her eyes, and hugged her. It was the first time Helene truly believed the war was over. Years later, she moved to America. Not to New York or Chicago, but back to Texas, the only place that had ever felt like peace. She opened a small bakery outside San Angelo, where she sold apple strudel dusted with cinnamon and pecans. Above the counter hung a single-framed photograph. A young woman in 1945, wearing a cowboy hat too large for her head, standing beside a rancher with a quiet smile. Beneath it was a simple inscription: "From enemies to neighbors." People who visited asked about the picture. Helene always smiled and said, "That's the man who taught me what freedom sounds like. It sounds like someone saying good morning instead of giving an order." When she died in 1984, the townspeople held a small service. Ranchers, soldiers, and immigrants came together under the wide Texas sky. They said she had carried 2 countries inside her heart and made them shake hands. History books might forget her name, but her story lingered in letters, in memories, in the quiet decency passed from one generation to the next. Because sometimes, the greatest victory is not won in battle, but in forgiveness. And somewhere, in the wind that still sweeps across the plains, you can almost hear her whisper it. Freedom isn't about fences. It's about the grace to open a gate.